Almost everyone is seated, so I can stop stalling. Our second panel today really takes a look at where the rubber meets the road and some of the critical foreign policy foci of the United States, specifically Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. We have a distinguished panel. Our chair of this panel is a faculty member at Georgetown University. She teaches in the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. She's also a full-time faculty member at Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. Please help me welcome our chair, Professor Rebecca Johnson.
Well, what I thought we would do, I know we've only got an hour and a half for the panel, and I have a hunch that everyone up here would certainly like to hear what you all are interested in. So rather than doing a more formal, lengthy introduction, what I would like to do is recommend that you all look at our speakers' bios, which is on the event website for Berkley Center for today's event. But I'm delighted to have everyone here this afternoon. I'm delighted for us to have the opportunity to talk about religious freedom and national security in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. We certainly couldn't have a more distinct or distinguished panel to do so. A couple of ground rules to get us started. Each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes of comments, as I understand, and I will do my best to wrangle those 15 minutes. I spend my days wrangling Marines, so I feel fairly confident that I can do so today. That means that we'll have roughly half of our time for Q&A and engagement with you all in the audience. So be thinking of your questions. We will have plenty of time to discuss them. I think it might make most sense just to stay in the order that we've got in the program, and that would mean that I'll start off by turning it over to you, Mr. Knox Thames, from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Knox? You get whichever you'd be more comfortable.
I'll sit here. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Tom Farr and the Berkley Center for inviting me to participate in this panel today. First, let me give a brief word of explanation about the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We were created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, and we are a unique entity within the U.S. government that monitors religious freedom worldwide and makes independent policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress. USRF is not part of the executive branch. We're separate from the State Department, and we are led by 9 commissioners appointed by the White House and Congress. Our main role is to analyze the facts and circumstances in countries around the world to determine where the most egregious violations of religious freedom, and then to devise policy recommendations for how the United States can effectively engage. We gather information from a wide source of NGOs, religious groups, think tanks, government entities, and we travel, hold hearings and events, and issue reports. Our main report is our annual report, which comes out every May 1st. The 2010 report covered 28 countries. And in addition to documenting violations, also had a section of detailed recommendations for how the U.S. government can more smartly engage religious freedom. Some other provisions that the International Religious Freedom Act mandated that I'll touch on here, as it will come up later in my presentation, is the Office of International Religious Freedom within the State Department. They too produce an annual report, but they cover every country in the world. And they are led by an ambassador at large for international religious freedom, who also serves as an ex officio member of our commission. One important thing that the International Religious Freedom Act did was to create a special designation for the most egregious violators of religious freedom called Countries of Particular Concern, or CPC. And those are countries whose governments either engage in or tolerate systematic, ongoing, and egregious abuses of religious freedom. And the law gave the State Department a variety of tools to help encourage better behavior, including negotiating a bilateral agreement, imposing sanctions, or issuing a waiver. Currently, there are 8 countries on the official State Department CPC list: Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. USRF, my commission, we agree with those designations, but believe 5 additional countries meet the CPC threshold. Those 5 are Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Vietnam. And then in addition, at the commission, we maintain a watch list of countries where the situation hasn't deteriorated to the level that it would meet the CPC threshold, but we want to put policymakers on alert that there's negative developments and put forward some ideas for ways we can engage creatively to avert a real deterioration of conditions. There are currently 12 countries on our watch list. One of those is Afghanistan. The bulk of my presentation will focus on Afghanistan, but let me touch briefly on the Commission's findings regarding Iraq and Pakistan. In Iraq, the Commission has concluded that ongoing systematic and egregious violations of religious freedom continue, and that members of the country's smallest religious minorities still suffer from targeted violence, and threats, and intimidation, with perpetrators of such attacks rarely identified, investigated, or punished. These small communities also experience a pattern of official discrimination, marginalization, and neglect, and there continue to be sectarian attacks, often with impunity, between Shia and Sunni Iraqis. And because of these, USERF recommended that Iraq be a CPC in 2010 and had done so in the previous years. Concerning Pakistan, we also find that systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom occur. There is religiously discriminatory legislation like the anti-Ahmadi laws and the blasphemy laws, and these foster a climate of intolerance. Sectarian and religiously motivated violence is chronic, and the government has failed to protect members of religious minorities who are targeted by this violence. And so because of these and other reasons, the Commission has also recommended that Pakistan be designated a CPC. Now, regarding Afghanistan, the Commission has placed Afghanistan on its watch list for the past 5 years because of concerns over deteriorating religious freedom conditions and other human rights abuses. Conditions for religious freedom remain gravely problematic in Afghanistan, despite gains in human rights since the ouster of the Taliban in 2001. And so for the panel discussion today, religious freedom and national security, I think Afghanistan is really the nexus where these two issues come together and where religious freedom promotion can have a positive impact for our national security. The United States mission in Afghanistan is at a critical turning point. We are at the high water mark of U.S. troop levels, and we are expanding reconciliation efforts with insurgents. At the same time, popular support for the Karzai government has eroded, and resurgent Taliban and other anti-government elements continue to engage in intimidation, attacks, bombings, and abductions, all while justifying these acts by having hijacked the narrative of religion. In addition to this challenging security environment, the situation for democracy, human rights, and religious freedom is precarious and problematic in many parts of the country. So in this context, can the United States engage the religious landscape in a way that promotes religious freedom and our national security? Can we challenge the negative religious narrative offered by the Taliban and undermine their popularity with the population at large? And can the United States push for religious freedom protections in a way that counters extremism and doesn't trigger a backlash and more abuses? I think the answer to all these questions is yes, but it will require sensitivity, dexterity, and commitment. A promotion of religious freedom can definitely have a positive impact in reducing religious extremism and violence in Afghanistan. Now, as we all know, the conflict in Afghanistan is occurring within a religious narrative, as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda both espouse religious worldviews to justify their ambitions. However, much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment seems to view the role of religion as irrelevant or almost so. For instance, nowhere in the 2010 Afghan and Pakistan regional stabilization strategy does the word religion appear. Considering that South Asia is one of the most religious regions of the world, it is troubling that U.S. policymakers accord it no role or consideration in their planning. The Norwegian Peacebuilding Center reported this summer, actually, here at Georgetown, about how religious moderates in Afghanistan are being forced to the political margins or cowed into silence by violence. Many of these religious leaders likely fear prosecution, imprisonment, and possible execution for statements that some would consider blasphemous. With this occurring, religious extremists have been able to dominate the discussion about religion and politics and have pulled Afghanistan further towards the very groups the U.S. intervened against. Some in the U.S. government are becoming sensitive to this. American Rear Admiral Gregory Smith, who's the chief spokesman for NATO, was quoted in the Washington Post in October saying that the Taliban has co-opted the religious narrative for years. To counter this, the United States needs to incorporate a greater awareness of the religious dynamic into our strategy. And specifically, I would suggest that we need to consider how we augment our counterinsurgency efforts. Counterinsurgency focuses on the concept of population-centric warfare and protecting the population. Now, some interesting points about counterinsurgency methodologies. The Counterinsurgency Field Manual for the U.S. Army and Marines focuses on winning the hearts and minds of the majority of the population. The manual outlines tactics for pulling away the uncommitted middle from the irreconcilable insurgents into the orbit of the government. And it highlights how religious leaders and communities should be targeted for such outreach. Since legitimacy is the main objective, bringing their influence alongside that of the government will bolster its standing in the eyes of the countrymen and further facilitate reconciliation. However, from my reading of the manual and from what I've seen of discussions on these strategies, none of them contemplate the consequence of pulling neo-Taliban religious leaders into the fold of Kabul. There's a real danger here. The weak and weakly secular Afghan government cannot withstand the pressure religious leaders can bring to bear on social and political issues. The outcome is that the government moves to accommodate their views, becoming more religious and less secular, more rigid and less accommodating. This is happening already. In the early fall, the 350-member government-backed Ulama Council voted to demand that President Karzai implement Sharia law. This is alarming because if it was implemented, it would be a major reversal of progress on human rights and democracy since the fall of the Taliban. So if these forces remain unaddressed, there's a real possibility that the blood and treasure spent by the United States to oust the Taliban could ultimately result in the reestablishment of neo-Taliban rule. Therefore, part of the answer to prevent violent religious extremists from dominating the debate on religious matters is by allowing and protecting other Islamic perspectives. Creating a civic space in Afghanistan where different religious interpretations can be shared and debated on a variety of critical issues, both religious and political, can give politically moderate religious leaders the critical oxygen they need to survive. Call this supporting religious freedom or creating civic space for Muslims, but either way it would counter extremism. The opening of this civic space could help displace Taliban influence from social networks by creating opportunities for peaceful religious debate, alternative views, and pluralism. New voices could emerge with alternative and less violent interpretations of Islam, and this could supplant the insurgents' religious views that hold sway over the population, helping lead to their marginalization and denying them a popular base in the Islamic faith. In short, you could call this population-centric warfare by promoting religious freedom. But for this to work, there would need to be a recalibration of U.S. policies to make creating civic space for religious groups a priority. The U.S. government needn't play necessarily a public role, but could put its thumb on the scales to ensure that politically moderate religious leaders can successfully engage in the political religious scene. Concerns about getting it wrong and having it backfire are legitimate, but America is a religious country with smart people who know how to gauge sensitively. So I would suggest two interconnected approaches, one empowering actors on the ground and one that exposes Afghanis to outside experts and new information. So in this regard, some possible activities could include, first, bolstering the position of Afghans who advocate respect for human rights and tolerance. Steps can be taken to amplify the voices of politically moderate religious leaders, political reformers, and human rights defenders. This can be done privately by encouraging President Karzai to appoint these individuals to the country's Human Rights Commission, government positions, court system, various ulama councils, and jirgas. Secondly, ensure inclusive reconciliation talks. In September, President Karzai established a committee that will attempt to broker a peace deal with the Taliban and other insurgents. Members of this committee include warlords, clerics described as pro-government, tribal elders, and a handful of women. With frequent news stories about ongoing overtures to the Taliban and the contours of a grand bargain possibly emerging soon, now is the time to ensure that politically moderate religious leaders, representatives of civil society, including Shia Muslims, members of other religious and ethnic minorities, and women, are included in the reconciliation talks, and that any reconciliation process doesn't provide immunity to known human rights violators. Thirdly, I'd suggest that we should work to expose Afghan religious leaders to other models of mosque-state relations. The U.S. government can facilitate trips through the International Visitors Program to the United States to show how we have dealt with issues of church-state relations. We could also increase people-to-people exchanges, or maybe even priest-to-priest. If it's difficult to bring Afghan religious leaders out, let's take Americans in. The Special Envoy Hussein mentioned briefly his trip to Afghanistan. I heard very positive things about it, the way he was able to engage religious leaders, government officials, civil society representatives. So other U.S. officials with a religion portfolio should also visit, like the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, the Special Representative to Muslim Communities, the Special Envoy for Anti-Semitism, and commissioners from USERF. And lastly, education. Our policymakers need to ensure that programs administered by USAID help develop primary and secondary education, such as through the printing of textbooks that incorporates freedom of religion or belief and religious tolerance. So in the few minutes I have remaining, how do we do this? To have impact, it must be a whole of government response coordinated at the highest levels and not approached piecemeal. There is no silver bullet that can change the course of the conflict, but a range of coordinated activities could begin to push our adversaries off balance and create counter-narratives and help bring about success over the long haul. So a few suggestions and ideas to consider. One is to ensure high-level coordination. If we're going to have a whole of government response, there's got to be the point person. Right now, we have this ad hoc array of offices and envoys on religion issues operating without any strategic guidance or framework. Staffing a senior position to pull these disparate efforts into a synchronized effort would be very positive. It could come out of Ambassador Holbrooke's office, or it could come out of the NSC. The International Religious Freedom Act actually authorized the staffing of an NSC position to work on religious freedom issues, so the authorities already exist. We also need to work to increase the State Department's ability to understand religion. For 10 years, we've had the small Office of International Religious Freedom. It's done very good reporting on issues relating to religion and society and violations against religious freedom. Under the Obama administration, it's also expanded to include religious engagement. But to make it more effective, we should think about elevating it to the Secretary's office, as many think the International Religious Freedom Act intended, or perhaps the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. The staff should also be expanded so it can meet these new burdens and have an expeditionary capacity. One element to think about is the chaplaincy corps. A new doctrine was established last year on religious leader engagement through the issuance of Joint Publication 105 for Religious Affairs and Joint Operations. And this gives commanders in the field the option of using chaplains to engage religious leaders in their area of responsibility. Chaplains have the potential to give commanders an understanding of the needs of local communities on these complex battlefields from a religious perspective while not violating their non-combatant status. And if chaplains are resourced and properly trained for this new mission, I think it could become a real asset. Another suggestion would be ensuring that U.S. personnel have a better understanding of the religious dynamics on the ground. The Foreign Service Institute and the various professional military education schools should consider increasing their teaching on religion and religious freedom before U.S. personnel are deployed. Through better trained State Department and military officials, the improved religious IQ of the U.S. government could lead to an enhanced understanding of the role specific religious leaders play. These better trained officials could join human trained teams and PRTs to help them evaluate the statements and actions to determine who supports the ISAF mission. More than an anthropological approach that views religion as an artifact, these individuals could give the United States a tactical sense of the religious terrain that would feed into an overarching strategy of creating civic space by supporting those who oppose violent extremism. And then lastly, engaging in theater. In the context of increased military activity by the United States and ISAF, the U.S. should work to ensure that any engagement or partnership with Afghan religious leaders is mindful of the religious dynamic and international standards on religious freedom. There's been some good work started down at CENTCOM with the AFPAC Center of Excellence and the CENTCOM chaplain. And more could be done with increased public diplomacy efforts, programming through Voice of America to increase discussions about religion and society. So in conclusion, nothing really focuses the mind like being shot at, and nothing stirs up passions as much as talk of religion. The Taliban successfully mixes these two to win the hearts and minds of the various Afghan tribes or to force them into submission. In this context, the United States must engage the negative religious narrative that the Taliban forces on the populace while honoring our commitment to religious freedom both in our Constitution and international law. Promoting religious freedom can bolster our national security goals and needs to be at the center of U.S. government activity. We've often said at the Commission that religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine for human rights abuses, and this is certainly the case in Afghanistan. Engaging smartly can delegitimize the Taliban narrative and legitimize other voices in Afghan society. Doing nothing cedes too much to insurgents and positions them to shape the contours of that society in ways antithetical to U.S. long-term and national security and democracy goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Professor Andrew Natsios, a former administrator for U.S. Agency for International Development and current Georgetown University professor. Thank you.
While I was USAID administrator, I had a practice whenever I visited a country when there was an aid mission of engaging with the religious leaders, regardless of the tradition. And so when I went to Ethiopia, for example, to initiate the HIV/AIDS response, I met with the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which of course is 1,700 years old. I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian myself, so it was a little easy for me to see him. But I also met the grand mullah, the grand imam of the Sufist Council, which is the tradition of Islam. 40% of Ethiopia is Muslim. And I had a very cordial conversation. In fact, each time I'd go, I would meet with him. He was not in good health. But the two great traditions helped us with the HIV/AIDS program in Ethiopia in terms of, now this was in a public health area, which was sort of interesting. In AID's program in Bangladesh after 9/11, we were asked by the government of Bangladesh through the American Embassy to initiate in the Quranic Institute a development program run by AID to train mullahs in development issues. And so we instituted a curriculum on women's rights, on fish farming, on public health issues, on education. And they would actually use this in their preaching sometimes at the Friday prayers. I went and visited this because this is sort of a famous program in AID because it was requested by we would not normally go up to a Quranic Institute and offer to add a curriculum in. But I was told by the chairman of the institute that it was the most popular program in the Quranic Institute, which was quite interesting. It was a very large institute. When I went, I was standing next to a man who was a mullah, and he was one of the leaders, but he had his own mosque near the Indian border. And he went into a rage while we were talking, and I was afraid I had offended him by saying something. And sometimes I do lose my temper or I say something. But in this particular case, I hadn't. I didn't know what I said. And I turned to someone who could speak Bangladeshi, and they said, no, he's not upset with you. He's upset with the human trafficking in his area. And AID, through this program, helped him set up a program among all the mosques to stop the trafficking to the brothels in Mumbai. And this is the story he told, very emotionally. His daughter disappeared, his 9-year-old daughter, and he and his wife believed that she had been kidnapped because they're right near the border area, and that human traffickers would come in and kidnap them. And they went crazy. And it turns out that had been a storm, she got lost, and she was with relatives in a neighboring village. She was fine. But after that happened, he came to the Quranic Institute and talked to the 8 instructors and said, we need something about this problem of the traffickers in our 4 provinces or the 4 counties where this is common. And we set the system up, and it cleared out. I have to tell you, when you have 1,000 mullahs preaching on this issue in Friday mosque, it has a very powerful effect. So there are ways through our aid program to engage with the religious communities. We had a problem in Nigeria with the immunization of children against polio. We almost wiped it out worldwide. And one of the branch schools of Al-Qaeda actually spread the rumor that if you had your child immunized, they would be sterilized if they were a boy. And there was a secret sterilization by Christians too. And this ended our campaign, and then polio spread all over the world again, and we're back to normal. So we said we made a mistake. We did not engage with the religious community. So in Bangladesh, in India, and in Indonesia, we didn't do any polio in the second campaign, any polio immunization, unless we went to the Quranic Council or the Islamic Council of Muslim Doctors, which is a big institution in many of these countries, to get their approval. And then we had the ulama in the country to issue a fatwa that if you do not have your child immunized, you're in violation of Islamic teaching. And I think this did a number of things. One, it engaged the religious community on development issues, but it also showed that the U.S. government's aid program was in a conversation in a very constructive way with these communities. I'll tell one last story before I get to the 5 proposals I would like to make, and that is I had a friend when I would engage in Afghanistan. Mullah Faisal was his name. He was the most famous mullah in Kandahar, the center of the Taliban's support, and it's a Pushtun area in the south east of Afghanistan. His father was the first mullah murdered by the Russians during the Russian invasion, so he's a very famous family and a famous figure. And he was a very, very strident supporter of democracy, and I shouldn't use the word strident, a very strong supporter of democracy, human rights, and of tolerance, And he and I would whenever I go to I always see him. Well, he organized, I didn't tell him to do it, he did it, and he said, Andrew, I want to do this. And I said, well, you're at some risk, it's still an insurgency. He organized 1,400 mullahs to condemn al-Qaeda and Taliban for their intolerance and to support democracy and human rights and to insist on the support for elections free and fair without any intimidation. Al-Qaeda was so upset, they attempted to assassinate him 3 times. The first 2 times they were unsuccessful. He told me Allah protected him. And the 3rd time, very sadly, just before I left office, my staff came in and said, your friend was murdered last night, Andrew, and the staff thought you should know. And he was a revered figure. Whenever we talk about people who support democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and religious tolerance, which are issues that are related to each other, we are putting at risk, we should know, an insurgency with people who have no hesitancy in using weapons, the very people who are our allies and friends. So whenever we do this, we talk here. We're okay here. We're not going to get assassinated for advocating something controversial. That is not the case in many countries, and it's certainly not the case in Afghanistan. And my friend, Mullah Faisal, is an example of exactly what happens when someone insists on these issues publicly. They're murdered. And he was murdered on these issues specifically because they told him this notion that you organize the rest of the mosques to support this position is outrageous. I think I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I have to say, because I'm from the Eastern Church, we have more connection with the Muslim world than any other tradition in Christianity since the Prophet. So, I mean, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was the first to touch the empire that followed the Prophet's preaching on earth and the appearance of Islam. And we have records now. It's very interesting. There's a book been written on the connection between the Sufist saints of the, I think it's the 8th century. Several major Sufist theological figures apparently were in conversation with the Eastern Church Fathers, our most revered figures of the 8th century. And they had some fascinating conversations, and there's a new book of essays. It's a very abstract, I have to say. I try to read it, and you get lost in the theology of it. But the fact is they had very cordial relations. And so if you talk to the Orthodox, they would say, we need a bridge, Andrew, with the Sufists. And I've met Sufists all over the world say, the Sufists are your bridge to the Western world. And I believe that. However, I've done a lot of thinking in the last year, and I want to make some arguments that are a little bit at a different trajectory than where I've been in the past. The problem is, if we make the Sufis, who are the most pacific and has the greatest level of tolerance because of the nature of their view of Islam. I met a Saudi diplomat one night after 9/11, and we were talking about this issue of religious tolerance, and I mentioned the Sufis, and he said, the Sufis are not Muslims. And I said, I beg your pardon. I mean, I have most Sufist friends, and they think they're Muslim. He said, they're not Muslim. They're heretics. And I was a little troubled by that. So there are issues within Islam which I think sort of the West does not understand. As there are among Christian denominations, too. My wife is Catholic, and I have a fundamentalist Protestant friends who say the Catholics aren't Christians, and it enrages me, of course. But so the points I've come to in this debate are this. And the first is that I don't think we should associate with one tradition within Islam, even if they're the most tolerant, because we then have an alliance with one of the schools or one of the traditions instead of reaching out to the whole community. And I think a different approach, I'm not saying this dealing with the Sufis is a bad idea. I have a personal prejudice to deal with them because there are so many mystical practices of contemplation in the Orthodox Church that are similar to the Sufist traditions, which are very beautiful. In fact, I went to a Sufist mosque in Rabat once, And I was stunned. I closed my eyes. I thought I was in an Orthodox church because the chanting was almost the same as the chanting in the Orthodox Church. And I don't know whether there was any cross-liturgical music traditions, but apparently there may have been, because it was very, very similar, even though it was in Arabic. I go to an Arab Orthodox church, and they are Christians, but our patriarch is in Damascus, as a matter of fact. So I know many Arab Christians from the United States, from the Middle East, who have immigrated here, who are members of my church. I've come to the conclusion, I think the notion of tolerance as a civic or constitutional or rule of law issue is where we need to move on this. And there are 5 principles that I think we should focus on when we look at this issue. And the first is that we need to look at each country differently. And this shows my bias coming out of the development community, but you don't have successful development. And development is all about change and transformation. That's what development is, ultimately. It's not, people think it's delivery of services and doing these little NGO projects. That's not what development is. Development is change. It's building institutions that are indigenous in the society and sustainable when the outside support ends. If you don't have some roots like Mullah Faisal, that's why I always used to see him. He was the genuine thing. And he was a hero among the people in the Pushtun tribe. In the Pushtun tribe, he was a hero. If you don't have roots in the society, anything we do externally is not going to work. That doesn't mean we don't support people in these countries, but there have to be local people. You can't send people from the outside, the UN or the United States or Western Europe, and expect there to be any traction in the society. The second is there is no standard way of doing this. I mean, I'm not being critical of your general ideas, but the fact is some things should be done more in some countries than other countries. And some approaches are remarkably successful in some, and they will be a failure in other countries, because culture also affects religion. I mean, you can say that it has no effect. I mean, I come out of a church tradition where we have local autonomy in our cultures, and you can see the Orthodox Church theologically is the same, but in certain liturgical practices, it's changed over the centuries because it's so rooted in the culture and the nationality of the countries. In fact, some people think that's the great weakness of the Orthodox Church, is this overemphasis on the culture of the country in which the Orthodox Church grew. So I think the second point is we should avoid standard templates that will work everywhere. They won't work everywhere. They need to be looked at locally. The third is this doesn't happen over time. I mean, quickly. It happens over time. Change is incremental. I mean, I know some people believe in revolutions. I don't like revolutions. I don't like revolutions anywhere because they tend to move toward violence. Things get out of control. There are unintended consequences. The best change is slow and incremental over time. And Americans have a problem with this because we are so impatient. So impatient with everything we do. We want, I just wrote an article for the Center for Global Development criticizing this notion of metrics, which is driving me nuts in the development community. Numbers for everything. They want metrics like, oh, this were General Motors. We're manufacturing a car. We want all these programs from these NGOs that we're supporting in the development. Come up with metrics. How do you come up with the metrics for improved tolerance? I don't know how we would quantify that. But there are people in AID that are ramming it down AIDs through the Inspector General's office, the General Accounting Office, congressional committees, the F office in state, the OMB, all want numbers for everything. So I hope you do not, let me just say this to you, I hope you not, in granting you're making your grants, engage in this American industrial practice of imposing on change in other countries that take place over a very long time, quantitative metrics for everything. If you do that, I will write you a letter. It's a threat.
We don't fund, so.
You don't fund, okay. Well, whoever funds in state the $4 million, they should avoid metrics, okay? The fourth principle here is to engage the elites and the general population simultaneously. We funded AID funded, and Kent Hill and I, who was a major figure in the evangelical church, he was at AID, and the two of us went to the conference in Morocco of all the great religious traditions. There were some Orthodox rabbis there were Lutheran and Catholic theologians, there was an imam from a Sufist sect with 10 million followers from Nigeria. We had Buddhist figures, Hindu figures, and Mahatma Gandhi's grandson chaired the event. It was a closed meeting, which is kind of sad because it was so interesting to listen to this discussion. But we only sometimes engage with the elites. And I think there needs to be a discussion. And I would argue, you made this point, that one way, in Afghanistan at least, is through the radio. You have to do this very carefully, because if you put pictures up, it's more striking and maybe more dangerous, more difficult for people to take. When we first established there, I think the 58 radio stations AID now has helped establish through Internews, through grant making over the last 9 years, and very successful program. One of the most successful we've run. There's a Harvard Business School case study on how successful AID's media building program in Afghanistan has been. But we're finding huge resistance because we have women and men, young men and women, in the same radio studio broadcasting at the same time. And they had bomb threats when they started. It's okay now. But if they saw them physically in the same room broadcasting there, I think there would have been some bombings. Now it's accepted on the radio. TV would be difficult. In Afghan's context, I'm just talking about Afghan. So, because your question was, what do we do in Iraq and Afghanistan? The last point I'd make is this. I think we need to appeal to the sacred text of the major traditions. There is a line in the Quran of many which says there is no compulsion in religion, and there are other quotes as well in terms of violence. Those need to be appealed to. But I'll conclude with this one comment. The Ayatollah Sistani, probably the most revered prelate in the Shia tradition, worldwide, not just in Iraq, is the major factor for the stability in Iraq. I think people realize, and he doesn't meet Westerners. I wanted to go meet him repeatedly, and they said, no, he doesn't. I said, I'm the aid person. He actually issued a fatwa saying Shia may not work on any Defense Department or State Department development project, but they can work on AID projects. He actually made a distinction. I almost wanted to go thank him for making that distinction between the aid program and the rest of the U.S. government. He initially opposed, strenuously opposed, the extra majority vote required by the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, for the Constitution that was going to be voted on, that we had worked with the Iraqis on. In other words, we were requiring more than 50% support, just as we did for our Constitution. And we never explained that to the Iraqis for some reason. I don't know why we didn't, but we didn't. A friend of mine, who's an imam, I won't tell you who he is, actually not a friend of mine. He came to this conference in Rabat, and he and I had lunch together, and he told me this story. He said, the Ayatollah called for me. He was a Shia, even though he's a career veteran diplomat from a Gulf state. He was in America for many years, and he loves the American Constitution, American constitutional history, and the rule. And he's a lawyer, constitutional scholar of considerable note, apparently, and is Shia. And he was called by the Ayatollah to come brief him on why the Americans were insisting on this extra majority vote. I thought the American embassy organized, and the American embassy didn't even know what went on. He said, I did this secretly. I was told not to tell anyone. I went and briefed him for 2 hours. And I said, this was in the controversy over the extra majority. I said, what did you tell him? He said, I told him the Americans believe in majority rule, but minority rights. And he said, what does minority rights mean? This means everybody, including the Christians in Iraq and the Sunnis, have the same rights everybody else has to worship as they want to and to speak in public, but they can't make decisions, that will govern unless there's a majority. And he said, when did the Americans think this up? The last 40 or 50 years? He said, no, 225 years ago. It was required in the Constitution. And the Ayatollah said, the Americans invented this 220. He said, that's why the country's been stable. I mean, not completely stable. For 225 years, we don't have violent demonstrations every day all over the country on issues. We resolve our issues most of the time peacefully. And he was astonished. He left. 2 weeks later, he announced publicly, the Ayatollah, that he would support the extra majority, even though that disempowered the Shia, who are 60% of Iraq. I think we need to engage with figures of that kind of stature in these countries who have enormous moral authority. He has more moral authority in Iraq than anyone else, frankly. And he is the kind of person to whom these arguments would have great appeal, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, we have Ambassador Hussein, who's the former Pakistani ambassador to Brazil, Spain, and Japan, and is also a current Georgetown University professor. Ambassador
Thank you.
Hussein.
We have had very good discussions this morning, and I have no point of disagreement with any of them, and what I'm going to say is not something contrarian or in conflict with what has been said, especially by my two co-panelists here, but from a very, very different perspective. In one sense, I'm going to give you a larger perspective, a strategic perspective, and in another sense, I'm going to sort of make a point that religious freedom does not stand alone. It's part of a society's identity, historical experience, cultural perspectives, social structure and values, power distribution, worldview, sense of history, and openness to knowledge. Indeed, the core organizing ideas of a society. What matters for the US national security is this overall context that hosts the religious freedom or the lack of it. So what context does Pakistan provide for religious freedom? Here is an excerpt from the speech of its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, made to the First Constituent Assembly of Pakistan on August 11, 1947. He said, "We are starting in the days where there is no discrimination, no distinction between one community and another, no discrimination between one caste or creed and another. We are starting with this fundamental principle that we are all citizens and equal citizens of one state." What has happened that Pakistan of today has strayed far too much away from this vision. Indeed, it has lost its way. Seemingly, there is a battle raging for the soul of Pakistan with competing visions of Pakistan's identity and national purpose and place of religion in life. Indeed, there are competing visions of religion itself. The country has been further caught up in the cross currents of sectarian, ethno-linguistic, and other domestic tensions, and its national priorities have come to focus far too much on security, external security, that is. Yes, religious freedom as a fundamental right does exist in the Pakistan Constitution. Article 20 guarantees it. If Pakistan's body politic had followed the Constitution in substance, religious freedom would have benefited too. But the story has been a little different. To begin with, the laws themselves have to a degree sabotaged the religious freedom. The treatment of Ahmadis as non-Muslims by the Constitution and the blasphemy laws are a case in point. In practice, the situation is even worse. Incidents of attacks on churches and places of worship of the Ahmadiyya community continue to happen. These communities do not feel safe. The blasphemy laws impact on minorities more than the Muslims. The government has been apathetic to these incidents, and so has generally been the judiciary. The media has not highlighted it unless it involves violence. And this is happening in a country, let me be very clear about that, where majority of the people have historically been moderate and remain so. But why are they appearing to have either turned extremist or to be supporting extremism or at a minimum tolerating it? Democracy may have provided an enabling environment for religious freedom, but Pakistan is a democracy, but barely. Unfortunately, Pakistan's social context that hosts its power imbalances, poor income distribution, the feudal political culture, and mental habits that go with it, the internal tensions, and the place of army make for a deformed politics. And Pakistan has not been successful in finding an open and stable political process that promotes tolerance and liberal habits of mind and supports justice for all, not only for its citizenry, but also for the smaller provinces and minorities. But Pakistan's internal dynamics has not been the only problem. The US foreign policy and the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, for which Pakistan has provided the main battleground, the global Islamic revivalism, the regional dynamics, especially the festering Kashmir issue, have also been a part of the problem. This not only degraded the political process, but also the governance. The war on terrorism and the Afghanistan war have made things much worse. It was already a troubled Pakistan with whom an unpopular America re-engaged after 9/11. America had been party to Pakistan's conflicts for decades for its support of successive dictatorships and poor governance by the civilians and the army both, had contributed to the wave of radicalization of the country, and ill-treated Pakistan after its services were no longer required. It was an America that had lost the trust of Pakistanis, that re-engaged with the enemy, with the country, to fight a war that was unpopular even before it began. When you define an enemy in such abstract terms as terrorism, you run the risk of magnifying the size of the enemy and enlarging the scope of the conflict. This is unfortunately what happened in the war on terrorism. It was conducted in the accompaniment of dangerous war hysteria that led to the profiling of Islam as a universal creed of terrorism. Everything wrong with the Muslim societies was equated with religion, thereby making the war on terrorism look like war in Islam. And the distinction between terrorists and their societies was blurred. The Afghanistan war has done its own damage. Not only did the military campaigns, especially in the beginning, lack a political strategy, but also in the rush to war, there was little effort at comprehending the nature of the threat or the enemy. Pakistan especially suffered, and so has America. The war has come to threaten Pakistan's integrity and stability, caused a deep sense of insecurity with these suicide attacks, and is seen as an affront to Pakistan's sovereignty, especially through drone attacks. Nobody called Pakistan the most dangerous country in the world before 9/11. As a result, Pakistanis are overwhelmed with negativity, almost bordering on paranoia, which is obstructing the emergence of an enlightened calculation of its national priorities, challenges. They do not have a clear roadmap for the future, and they are becoming insular. This is not the best mindset for basic human freedoms, including religious freedom. At best, they know what is wrong with the country, but cannot make up their mind as to why it is so, and who is responsible, and where we go from here, and how and with whose help. They like what they do not like and see enemy in a friend and a friend in an enemy. They hate terrorism but live with extremism. Pakistan cannot defeat terrorism or help the United States defeat it without defeating extremism. Extremism is a separate and indeed the main challenge. Religious freedom or the lack of it is a reflection of it, not the other way around. Where does the United States come in? Pakistan, like some other countries of the Islamic world, has been under a slow and sustained assault from an illiberal, pro-Western elite and religious extremism. The United States has alienated both. On one hand, by having historically blocked true democratic reform by supporting the army, and the other by appearing to be working against Islam in the wake of 9/11. These two forces are now both united in a fierce nationalism triggered by the war on terrorism and the Afghanistan war, both of which are seen as the cause of increasing threat to Pakistan. Anti-Americanism is making people vulnerable to radical propaganda. So in a deadly paradox, the democratic surge and the religious surge both overlap and conflict, with democratic ideas strengthening the religious surge and religiosity weakening the democratic surge. Both the religious fervor and the democratic aspirations in their own way have become an idiom of expression of people's anger, fear, hopes, spurred by idealism, ideology, populism, nationalism, moral and political activism, social discontent, economic dissatisfaction, political frustration, and personal happiness. So much has come into this variable mix. Have people all become radicals or extremists, whatever you may call them? Not really. It's not that people in their religion have become extremists or that they want Sharia. I don't think so. True, there has been a global Islamic revivalism, and in Pakistan particularly, it has had a telling effect, strengthening various Islamic tendencies, moral, political, and radical. As a consequence, the profile of Islamists and extremists has risen. But it's not so much their influence as it is their appeal. Some people listen to them for religious reasons, some for their social agenda, some for their political philosophy, and almost everyone for their anti-Americanism. That is what brings these people in contact with these radicals. Anti-Americanism has almost become like jihad, and the government stands idly by because of being weak and often lacking legitimacy. They fear that any action to moderate public attitudes may be seen as anti-Islam or pro-America. So here in the West, when you look at public perceptions in Pakistan, you get a feeling that people or even governments have become radicals. No wonder Bill O'Reilly can say with impunity that Muslims killed us on 9/11, but that's not true. At best, it's an impressionistic reality, and at worst, demonization. Is religious freedom susceptible to direct influence by the United States? No. Can the United States help? Yes, but not with its present policies. The United States does not even understand these societies very well. The government and the academia may understand, but not the public and the media, and that is what counts in politics, and without politics, there is no public policy. Similar gaps exist in Islamic countries, especially in Pakistan. Historically, the United States mainly related to Pakistan, as the ambassador was saying, through a largely unrepresentative and often exploitative elite, and not directly with the people. People would like to overthrow this status quo, and along with that, the perceived domination of any external power that sustains it. So, to a varying degree, both the United States and Pakistan have become adversaries in public perceptions at least. The United States has its own threat perceptions to its security, for which Pakistan is being blamed, rightly or wrongly. And in Pakistan, a lot has gone wrong. Not all of America is making, but in these troubled times, the United States and the West have become convenient scapegoats. The talk of an unavoidable conflict among religions is emphasized only by extremists and hardliners who are motivated by their domestic and local considerations. By cultivating the fear of the others, they get support for their hardline perspective. They tend to make people more inward-looking, with increased fear or distrust of those who do not belong to their religion. This kind of hardline religious approach builds pressures on religious minorities in any country, although the nature of pressure varies. At times, the phobia is created about the threat from a religious minority, Christians or Jews in Muslim-majority countries, Muslims in a non-Muslim majority country. Now, what the United States can do. Any direct role in promoting religious freedom will not only not work, but will be counterproductive. The United States needs Pakistan as a partner in fighting challenges to its security, but only a reformed Pakistan can be a good partner. Pakistan needs to reform, and it cannot do so without the US help. And the US cannot help without regaining some influence in Pakistan. For that, it needs to do something about anti-Americanism. And for that, as Ambassador also had just hinted, some adjustments in the US policies will be essential. Some movement has already taken place under the Obama administration, but still considerable gap remains between declaratory and actual policies. The United States also needs to change the context of the relationship with Pakistan, where the relationship is seen as a beneficial to the people. Only then the United States can influence domestic dynamics and promote conciliation and accommodation and coexistence, and indeed promote religious freedom. And then the United States, having re-earned people's trust, needs to encourage liberal and tolerant tendencies in these countries against the backdrop of democracy. If religious hardliners are pushed back, the society and the state will become secure. This also eases security pressures on the United States, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Both religious and cultural tolerance is closely linked with social and economic conditions, and above all, people's empowerment and a feeling whether they are getting social and economic justice. There is need to address the issue of human security and issues of poverty and underdevelopment in these societies. It's going to be a slow process, as has been observed, and I must compliment USAID. It has had the potential to do a lot of good for these societies, but with appropriate policies and with patience, and not with these metrics and markers and connecting the dots. I mean, that is. So it is going to be a slow process, but the long-term societal security in Pakistan and Afghanistan requires immediate attention to these issues. Only then you will have sort of pushback of religious extremism and terrorism, and it is doable. Let me conclude on a positive note. The tide of extremism, in my view, is reversible. The United States is not employing correct policies. It's not for want of political will or lack of sincerity, no. It's a question of judgment, question of knowledge, question of correcting the policies. These policies, instead of weakening, they are strengthening extremism, making it look like a bigger challenge than it actually is. Thank you.
Wonderful. I believe, do we have microphones? We do. So I would ask for the Q&A if you could stand up and identify yourselves, even if the speakers might know who you are. Other folks in the audience wouldn't. Let's start down here in the front, the lady in the blue shirt.
Lieutenant Commander Victoria Stadel, United States Navy. I just came back from Afghanistan about 2 months ago. I was there for 7 months, and I was in charge of training and development for all Afghan national security forces, and specifically police. So I dealt a lot with metrics, and I had a lot of frustration from my perspective about the fact that DOD is setting the tone, to say the least, in Afghanistan. We're obviously the largest force. We send about 30,000 young gentlemen through the police training. It takes 6 weeks to get them through. While I was there, we implemented a new basic patrolman course, which included parts of the Quran to explain why, human rights and whatnot. State Department said they wouldn't teach it because their contractors can't do religious bits. So in my perspective, we're our own worst enemy in a lot of ways. I think the idea of using chaplains is great, but I see it so far from our policy right now, where the commanders, despite what the last gentleman said about our best intentions, in reality, there's a lot of pressure to get people out the door, weapons in hand, and saying, yes, we trained these gentlemen, And in my perspective, what a lost opportunity when you have 18-year-old men running through training in 6 weeks and we can't tell them anything about religious tolerance, freedoms, and we're giving them a lot of AK-47 training. My question is, how do we change that? How do we change the tide? Because regardless of the conversation we have in this room, I can tell you from the perspective of 04 in Afghanistan, I can talk all day about the importance of certain training for these folks, but at the end of the day, my leader and my boss cares about the numbers that goes back to the White House, so he can say, good job. Thanks.
Anyone who would like to?
Yeah, let me, I don't want to go through I published this essay in July. It's 3 chapters in the book I'm writing on 4 and 8. This actually goes back to Robert McNamara. When McNamara came from Ford Motor to be Secretary of Defense, he took the industrialized assembly line metrics of the Ford Motor Company, along with some analysis by the Rand Corporation, to create metrics for running the Vietnam War. Colin Powell says in his biography, this is the biggest joke of the whole thing, he was a combat commander in Vietnam. He says, you know, we used to have these metrics that showed us we were winning the Vietnam War when in fact we were losing the Vietnam War. And so this was not just something that affected AID, it affected the World Bank, because then when he left DOD, he went to the World Bank. The World Bank business system now is designed by Robert McNamara based on Rand Corporation and DOD metrics that actually come from the automobile industry. The person chosen to oversee AID was a vice president of General Motors who had never been to the third world, a war zone, never run a development. And he was telling us what to do, and he wanted all these metrics. And I said, metrics are not particularly useful when you're designing an institution, which is what you're doing. Training police is 25% of building an effective police force. And 6 weeks training, I can just tell you, doesn't work. The programs that we've had over the years have had a profound effect. Our graduate programs in the United States that are 2 years long at least, and we have transformed some countries over 20 years where we trained the entire senior bureaucracy of a country with master's degrees or PhDs through American colleges. And the career staff will say it's the most powerful, but it takes 10 to 20 years. There's a disjuncture in Afghanistan between, and Pakistan and Iraq, and frankly, a lot of our programs, between the time horizon of diplomats, and I was a diplomat for 1.5 years as envoy to Sudan. I'm not criticizing diplomats. And I was a military officer for 23 years. I was a lieutenant colonel when I retired. I served in the first Gulf War. The military has even a shorter time frame than the State Department does in terms of results, this obsession with results, okay? The most successful institution building undertakings, not just for AID, but for the Europeans, for just generally, it takes several decades. Now, we've spent 9 years doing that. I was at the National Defense University giving a lecture, and they all said, oh, you were incompetent in AID. You can't build all these institutions. You've had 7 years. It's a few years ago I was there. And I said, really, how long have you been training the Afghan army? I said, do you have a functional army in Afghanistan? And the answer, of course, is no. Because it can't be done in that time frame. It doesn't make any difference what the commands are from the State Department or DOD. It's irrelevant. It's reality. It's called the reality of cultural change. It takes a long time to do it. So I think our presidents, Democrat and Republican, should be saying, we are going to be doing this for a very long time. You need to understand it's not going to be fixed by the next election. It can't be. And the other fear of the elites in Afghanistan from the beginning was you guys are going to leave. And all of us who committed to you, we're going to be assassinated when you leave. And I hate to say this, but there are predictions coming true, which is troubling to me.
Master Hussain, Mr. Thames?
I entirely agree with the ambassador. Institution sort of reform or strengthening, you have to go country by country. I mean, there are countries which are broken. Okay, there the task of institution building is different. There are countries where have the institutions, like Pakistan, but they're not working. The reason is because the institutions have become adjuncts to centers of power. They have lost their integrity. They are capable people. Many of them educated at Wharton and Harvard Kennedy School, I tell you. I mean, and Harvard law graduates in the judiciary and all that. So, they have lost their autonomy, they have lost their integrity, they are not working for the people, but for the people in power, for the elite. So they end up nourishing, sustaining, and strengthening an elite-based system which has effectively disempowered the people. Now, if you go and start sort of doing capacity building in the institutions, what are you doing? You're basically enhancing their capacity to do more harm. You're strengthening them to be more capable to look after their own interests. So this institution building has to be a differentiated thing. And I mean, in Afghanistan probably, which is somewhere in between, either broken or functional, perhaps somewhere in between, you have to see who are these people? What are their religious affiliations? What are their feelings of nationalism? What do they really feel about Taliban? They may tell you one thing, but deep down they may have different feelings. What do they think of American forces? Maybe up to a degree they're happy Americans are there sort of bringing some development and security, but at the same time they feel that it's an occupation power, because they have to, many of these people have to navigate between different value systems, and there's a different peer pressure. So the people you're dealing with very complex personalities. So it will take time, it will take amount of understanding. Can it be done? Yes. Can be done with present policies? No, but you can change the policy. In what time frame? A long time frame. Does America have the money and patience to do that? I doubt very much. And I think, in a sense, what I see it, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the military calendar is in conflict with the political calendar here in Washington. That's the crux.
I would just add briefly to your question about how do we get policymakers to change their mind? I don't know, and I think that's the ultimate question. And it's conversations like this that can, here in DC, that can get that conversation going. But I think your story is one I've heard in other contexts, just about the different approaches of the State Department and DOD on the issue of religion. For example, when I was meeting with a former CENTCON chaplain who retired about a year ago, he was telling me how he oversaw the building, the U.S. funds, of a chaplaincy school for the Afghan army, and how the military was supporting those institutions, whereas your story is the State Department is hesitant to even do maybe a 2-hour seminar overview class on religion and policing. So I think we talk about cultural change in Afghanistan, there's also a cultural change that needs to take place inside the U.S. State Department and other institutions.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. My name is Zanam, and I recently graduated in engineering from GW. And my first question is about the religion freedom. We always talk about the Muslim countries or Asia, but something is going in Europe as well. France has banned the burqa, the covering the head, and Spain is going to ban Israel as well in the essence of saying it's a security issue for us. And Switzerland has banned the building of the minarets in their country for the mosques. So does your report include those things as well? And are you going to suggest something to Congress and to the State Department about those countries as well? Because it's going to continue in Italy and other countries as well, in Belgium as well. And my second question is for Mr. Tokir as well. He was advisor to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in 1998 when he brought the President Tariq Hussein. He was his party senator, I think, at the moment. And he was the right hand of the founder of violence in Pakistan through the Maulana Ataullah Shah Bukhari. So you were advisor to Prime Minister, and you have seen a lot of things on the higher level of bureaucracy against Ahmadis and all those people. How do you see, how can we bring the change in Pakistan when the higher people are, like, if the president is totally against Ahmadis, how can we change all these things? Excuse me.
So on the issue about the commission and I'm reporting on events in Western Europe, since our mandate is really to focus on the worst violations of religious freedom, such as murder, torture, disappearances, haven't reported on incidents in France and Western Europe. We have issued statements periodically. For example, when the European Court upheld the French ban on religious dress in schools, we issued a statement. When the Swiss amended their constitution to ban the minarets, we issued a statement. So we do try to engage. Our sister office, the Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department, they do a report on every country in the world. And so I feel certain that these issues will most certainly be covered. And that report should be coming out soon. I'm looking over at my former colleagues over there. So.
No. I was, advisor, not in a political sense. Foreign Office sends the senior ambassador to the Prime Minister's office to act as a kind of liaison between the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister's office. It's a bureaucratic job, not a political job. I was advising only on foreign policy issues. But your observation is correct. I did see a lot of things of political nature when I was there, not in my official capacity, but as a personal observer, as a student of politics, I saw a lot of things. And much of what I've learned has already been reflected in many of my writings and teaching, and then my talk today. And I have said what's wrong with Pakistan, and a lot is wrong, and a lot needs to be done. And I agree with the ambassador entirely. Revolution is not the answer. We had one revolution in 1979 in the neighborhood, and that has sort of sent such shockwave that we are still all suffering from that. I mean, it has done harm in many diverse ways. People don't even realize what it has done. You don't have to be a Shia to be an admirer of that revolution. That revolution evokes admiration across the board among the Muslim world. Revolutions I don't like. We need change, we need reforms, we need a broad-based people's movement perhaps to set things right. I don't have much confidence in the politicians of Pakistan. I don't have any particular sort of view on one politician or the other. I see them as a class. They are mainly interested in their class interests, in their interests as feudals, in their interest as to sort of businessmen, not really for the people. So people need to look after their interest, but unfortunately, the events of international events, especially in the last 10 years, have now changed the entire debate in Pakistan as if our main problem is Islam. Islam is not our main problem. Nor can Islam be a solution. I think problems are socioeconomic, problems are political empowerment, problems are education, problems are modernization, problems are democratization, and there's a long-term challenge. And I'm not sure if Pakistanis have even begun the effort to change.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Amjad Chaudhary. I'm from Ahmadiyya movement, Muslim community. Actually, it was a very nice talk by all of the panelists, and I appreciate all the information they given to us. I'm just saying that the anti-American that developed in Pakistan or in some countries, I say after 9/11, I think the Americans have associated in doing the thing with enforcing their own diplomacy or something. But the thing is that, like he was saying, the chaplains in the army are now engaging into have a engagement with the mullahs or the Muslim clerks. And that is the effort that we need to continue on. And that the effort we need to develop on, and that should be done. And actually, there was something, he said all this effort is done slowly and incremental. And I totally agree with that. I'm saying on the other side, the first Messiah, when he came, it took him 300 years to change the world. And the second Messiah I believe the second Messiah has come, and it will change him 300 years to change the world. And I'm saying the only thing that we are offering is love for all, hatred for none. This is our slogan. And the best example I can tell you, in May 28 in Pakistan, they killed in 2 mosques, they killed 85 people from Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And there had not been any going away and killing anyone or breaking any laws or something like that. And that's what I'm saying. I appreciate he said that the chaplains are making the effort. I was in the Army. I'm a retired Army, US Army. And I can definitely say that if they can engage the mullahs or the Muslim clerks, that'll be very good for them.
Thank you. Ma'am, did you have a question in front?
So I'm sorry to sort of force the conversation back to the metrics conversation, but I'm an employee at USAID. I'm in the Office of Democracy and Governance, so I do see that we have, my office in particular has so much difficulty reporting on the impact that we've made, and so our metrics start to be something sort of piddling like how number of officials trained or number of elections supported with U.S. government assistance, whether those elections were free and fair. How do you show the impact of the respect for the rule of law? But the reason that we have those metrics are because the U.S. public needs to be shown that an agency like the Agency for International Development is making an impact. And I see that a lot of the U.S. public doesn't understand a lot of the things that we're doing abroad. And so I was wondering how, so you said, Administrator Natsios, that the president should state to the U.S. public that these things are going to take a long time. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what U.S. policymakers can do to not force these so much money and time being spent on developing these silly metrics.
Well, I'll just read the article's called The Clash of the Counter-Bureaucracy in Development. And it's on the Center for Global Development's website. Maybe a lot of people in aid are reading it because they're so frustrated with the system. When I was administrator, we commissioned the National Academy of Science, a very respected national institution, to go out to several large universities to do a study of AID, democracy and governance programs over a 20-year period from 1985 to 2005. And then we looked at the numbers of the billions of dollars we spent in those programs. We looked at the Freedom House Index on democracy and governance, and we saw what the relationship was. And the conclusion after several years of study was that the impact in the aggregate was that there was a significant impact by the expenditure of this money for these kinds of programs. You can get the study. I mean, people in the office know about the study, the older officers do, because it was the first time we've ever proven using social science research data. I'm not saying we should never use numbers, but this looked at them over 20 years, not quarterly indicators of metrics, which are not useful. They are not useful, okay? And by the way, the public doesn't know or care about metrics. If you showed them the metrics, you think they're going to support the programs because of the metrics? That's baloney. This is demanded by the IG, the GAO, OMB, and this act that was passed in 1993. I think it was written by the Bush administration, 1992, and then passed under President Clinton. It has nothing to do with party. And it requires, for every federal dollar spent, there has to be some outcome. I mean, if we provided technical assistance to the Federal Convention of 1787, which we, by the way, AIA does this all over the world. We help constitutional conventions as advisors. When the Afghan Constitution was written, we got an Australian woman legal scholar and a Kenyan who had just helped write the Kenyan Constitution, no Americans, to be the advisors to the Loya Jirga that wrote the Constitution. I asked the Loya Jirga members, is this helpful? Andrew was very helpful. There's all these different ways we could approach this. We get to choose some compromises and things because of the scholars coming in telling us how it was done. If we tried to have a metric for the Federal Convention that wrote the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia, do you think we could provide a metric? There isn't one scholar in the United States who would not say one of the reasons for our greatness as a country is the genius of the Founding Fathers in 1787 with no metrics whatsoever. In fact, Alexander Hamilton had no metrics when he was Secretary of the Treasury and he built the federal government. Okay, so I think this is required by the regulators, and it's counterproductive and destructive to our programming. The best programs don't have metrics approached, and particularly the democracy and governance program. But we can show over time, when you do a retrospective, a very healthy, robust relationship with the expenditure of money and broad improvements in democracy indexes. Okay, you can get the study. There's this long study the American. Ask them in the office. So we can prove they work. Can we prove every dollar works in every country every time? No, because sometimes they don't work. They don't work. Some constitutional conventions in some countries are a disaster. But we don't control that. We can give them advice only up to a certain point, and then the local leaders have to make some decisions. And if they make stupid decisions, I mean, you're going to blame us for that? I mean, we don't go in and write constitutions for other countries. We only help them through the process, doing the logistics to get everybody there, which we did for the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, and we give them advice on different options, and we can urge them up to a point, but then it's their constitution, and it's their right to make mistakes, which they do sometimes.
All right, we got time for one last question. Ma'am in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sabra Qureshi. I'm an independent consultant. Ambassador Hussain talked about one of the solutions is democratization. No one would disagree. We all realize the need to strengthen democratic systems in Muslim majority societies. And yet US policy, for all its talk about promoting and strengthening democracy, has looked at it in a slightly ambivalent and dichotomous way, because we do see the support to authoritarian regimes, Egypt, Pakistan till Musharraf, Saudi Arabia are cases in point. Now we know that the more democracy is curtailed or controlled in these countries, the more legitimacy the extremist forces get, and the more they repress religious freedoms, and it sort of goes on from there. Given the fact that the US has this rather ambivalent approach to democratization and wanting to control or at least have some sort of element of control on the outputs of these democratic processes. And you all talked also about the time that it takes to strengthen these democratic systems and institutions. How do we address this issue of US policy, on the one hand, not wanting to see an unleashing of so-called religious elements in the political systems? We know there's the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, with all of the religious political parties in Pakistan and other countries. And yet we know that there has to be a process where these political democratic systems will gradually emerge and strengthen to a point where the people can then, where you have leadership that is the moderate leadership that everyone would like to see. But in the meantime, controlling a democratic process to suit one's own objective is going to do more harm than any benefit. So I don't know, how can US policy address some of these dichotomies and ambivalence?
Well, United States is finally realizing that I think on balance, democratization is still better than blocking democracy. It has had fear of two kinds of forces that may come to power. That's why it has been reluctant to support democracy. One, forces that are very nationalistic, and it may not like these countries to play second fiddle to the United States' strategic interests. And second, the Islamic. Now, apart from metrics, another problem the United States has is it paints all these countries with a broad brush. There are countries which have no political process. There are countries which have some deformed political process. There are countries which have kind of a obstructed political process. So there's a whole range of variation. There are countries like Egypt, for example, where there has not been much tradition of liberal opposition to the government. So the only opposition that is coming from are the Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood. And the United States is perhaps legitimately worried that if these people come to power, they may bring sort of Islamicized version of democracy. But countries like Pakistan has had an open political process where Islamists are not the only alternative. There are two political parties, good and bad. They have existed for quite some time now, and I think if you promote democratic evolution or tendencies in Pakistan, the result is not necessarily that Islamists will come to power. Eventually, perhaps a government which is nationalistic, partly Islamic, but also at the same time pro-West could emerge. So I think the United States has to look at these countries in a differentiated manner and not be afraid. Where there is a real danger, there you can be heavy in the interest of your strategic and economic interest, be a little careful, and I understand the countries do look after their national interest, and that is perhaps very important. I'm not saying that democracy has to be promoted for the sake of democracy, because after all, the primary onus and the primary responsibility for bringing political change belongs to these countries, because it's a domestic thing. The United States can only play sort of a limited role. If these countries can't find a way of democratization, I don't know how the United States can help. Essentially, it's a domestic challenge. And probably these people will become democratic, in my view, I think, in the long run. What the United States should do is support a peaceful, slow evolution, keeping a balance between the interests of these countries and its own strategic and economic interests.
I would just add that one way is to look for domestic initiatives that you can support quietly. And in Pakistan, there's a little bit of a small bright light there. With in the federal cabinet, there's a federal minister for minorities affairs, Shahbaz Bhatti, whose portfolio is religious minorities in the country. And he's initiated this project of creating inner harmony committees in every district of the country, where you'd have 12 individuals, 6 Muslims and 6 from Christian, Hindu, and other Ahmadi and other minority communities together. And his viewpoint is this is a way to win the hearts and minds of the next generation of Pakistanis, to show that there's religious diversity, that you shouldn't hate the other is your brother or your sister. And it does have the support of the Zardari government. However, of course, it's always a matter of funding and getting it off the ground. And is this an opportunity for the U.S. to quietly support it, to take advantage of this opportunity of a domestic Pakistani initiative, so that the United States doesn't have to say, Pakistan, why don't you do this? It's Pakistan, why don't you do this more? I think there aren't many opportunities like that in many of these countries, but there is one there, and I think we need to support it as much as we can.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think it's encouraging that we have more questions than we have time. I think it shows the energy and interest in what is certainly a very important topic. So I'd like to thank our 3 speakers today.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers and to the audience. We are now at the end of a very, I think, stimulating series of discussions, particularly on religious freedom and national security. I'm not sure we've resolved that problem, but I hope we put a nail in the coffin of those damned metrics. So thank you all for coming. Look for our next event in this series on March 1st. As Eric mentioned before, check the Berkley Center website and you'll be hearing from us.